thank you so much for inviting me to help participate in this webinar. So you're welcome to call me Diane. Not that necessarily it'll come up, but that's my comfort most of the time. And my pronouns are she, her, and they. So if that is relevant at any time, that's a good thing to know. We are, as Professor Schuster said, we have 3 other speakers that are going to be actually sets of speakers that are going to be part of this particular webinar series. And so my fun job, and I say that without any sarcasm at all, actually, because this topic is super important, is to get to provide some of the historical background to some of the things that you're going to hear later next week with Douglas Adams, who is going to be talking to us from the New York City Mayor's office. And then we have Dr. Hernandez, who does a lot of work of the history of Sacramento in relation to all of this, as an expert in all of that. But he's going to be speaking more to what's happening now. What are some of those consequences? So you'll get to hear some really specific examples of both consequences and the ways that folks are working to address these issues, these long-term issues. And then our final group, our final presentation will be a panel of a number of other folks who are experts and activists in the area in relation to fair housing and gentrification and some of the work that they're doing. So I think you're going to get a really interesting look at a lot of different things that are happening now and what that means practically, especially for this kind of class, I think is super interesting. So I really appreciate, I can't say enough how excited I am that Professor Schuster asked me about this issue. And for me, it's as the dissertation that I wrote for my EDD had a lot to do with segregation and wealth inequality. And so any chance to actually get to talk about that a little bit is wonderful. So thanks very much. I just want to also recognize that we're talking about a massive amount of information in a relatively short period of time. So there certainly are some things I'm probably not going to spend much time on or gloss over. So it's totally fine if you have questions, and we'll see how we're doing. Professor Schuster will keep me on track on time, and if I'm not paying enough attention to the chat, he'll definitely hop in there. But don't be afraid about asking questions, and we'll definitely do our best to get to them. The other thing is, and we'll have time at the end as well, is just to recognize some of the documents that we're going to look at have very contextualized language, right, of that time. And so just to realize that some of the stuff that we're looking at, may be surprising, may not be in terms of language. But I just want you to keep that in mind, that they, the historical documents that we look at also will be very I keep thinking like Galaxy Quest when I'm saying historical documents. But anyway, okay, so it is, I will say, slightly odd to not see faces and not hear sound. So, I don't even know if people actually can hear me. It's one of those weird things. So I'm excited to pursue this area, this way of presenting. So just hang in there with me and we'll do fine. Okay, so we are going to talk about all the things Professor Schuster said. One of the things I haven't said enough about is we'll really also be talking about racially restrictive covenants and what does that mean? What does all that mean in terms of what's happening today, not just in terms of segregation, but also wealth, and what does that mean? And why should we care about any of that stuff? So as we get going, I do want you to think now, I don't want you to answer it right now, but I want you to think, what does this have to do with your class, right? And so even though Professor Schuster has mentioned some of that, I know you've read some things and you've talked a little bit about it. I want you to tell me at the end. So think about what it is that you think is relevant for your class and how is it relevant to what you're doing? Because I think it's actually, like I said, great that Professor Schuster is connecting something that's sort of a technical class, it sounds like to me, with this large context. And that's really an impressive thing to do, by the way, if y'all didn't know that already. Okay, so let's start. We're going to start really in the early 1900s or so, where this emergence of racially restrictive covenants, and these covenants basically are legal agreements that folks enter into, and it's usually property owners, subdivision developers, real estate operators, basically in particular neighborhoods, that bind them to who they're going to sell or not sell to, actually most of the time, sell their property to or rent their property to or any of those kinds of things. And there we're really talking about, of course, based on race or perceptions of race. So and so that's what we're going to begin with. And some of this is begins because of some of the migration patterns that are happening, especially around World War II. World War I. Some folks talk about the Great Migration as really beginning around 1916 or so, where we are the World War I industry, right? The buildup and the factories and so on needing workers, and so many African American families in the South, in particular, are looking for those economic opportunities, and so they are moving up to the north, and you see a lot of migration that time, which is why, of course, maybe they call it the Great Migration. But one of the things that we end up seeing also is, I mean, folks are also leaving because there are oppressive conditions in the South as well. So by this time, Jim Crow in the South, and I don't know if that's something you may have had in your history classes or not, but basically in the South, the attempt to reproduce as much as possible the conditions that existed during the time of slavery when humans were enslaved. So, that separation, the economic separation, the physical separation, social separation in every way. And often this is done in terms of terror, right? Folks are terrorizing community members to keep that separation happening. And so there's a lot of reasons that folks are not just, there's often when we're talking about migration, we're talking about pushes and pulls. So there's certainly a pull where there's economic opportunity, but there's also this push out of communities that have been or are to leave these the conditions in which people are feeling terrorized and being terrorized. So that's some of the stuff that's happening. And we see this emergence of racially restrictive covenants in the North in particular in response to that. So, and this is an example of what folks are leaving. You may or may not have heard of sundown towns in the South where basically, in particular, African American families are told you've got to be out by sundown, and that's not that's a real thing. James Lowen actually is if you're interested actually in that, has written a lot about sundown towns. So you might notice here there's like, oh wow, look at that fun dot. Okay, good place to live, beautiful homes, healing waters, beautiful parks, a city of real hospitality, right? And then if you look over here, these are points of reasons that this town is saying to move here: no malaria, no mosquitoes, and no Negroes, right? So here again, we begin to see these examples of sundown towns where folks are using this as a positive. And the reason again that folks know there are quote unquote no Negroes is because they've been chased out, threatened, right? And sometimes actually physically assaulted, right? And as part of that. So it is a really difficult time in the South in particular. And so this is an example of one of those first. This isn't sort of necessarily this is actually one of the earliest ones, in fact, that folks have found. So just so you can see an example of that, here's the language. It is further mutually covenanted that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Said restrictions and covenants shall run with the land, meaning that means it's no matter who owns it, right? That these restrictions are going to stay in place. And so this is what we're talking about, right? So this is when folks are beginning to, and I'm mostly talking about white folks, right? So they are used to segregation, even though these racially restrictive covenants come into play. The segregation has been has existed right before these things. We're just beginning to see these ideas become entrenched in other aspects of law. And so that's going to be an important part of understanding what happens historically. So there are a couple of cases that come along and say, okay, well, cities, municipalities, you can't be the one to mandate these racial restrictive zones, right? You can't exclude people from your town in this way, right? So these sundown towns and so on are being challenged because it's often the cities themselves. But they say, for the most part, yeah, that can't happen. Another case comes along, Corrigan versus Buckley, and says, well, okay, but racially restrictive covenants, that's okay. So tell me, or put in the chat, or if you want to say it in person, that's fine. But why do you think one thing was not okay, but the racially restrictive covenants were okay? Why do you think that might be? Dead silence. Okay, it was already silent, but any ideas? Professor Schuster, anybody have any idea why you think one might be money? Okay, I see money. Um, sure. So the question is, why would it not be okay for cities or municipalities to mandate racial zones, but why might the racially restrictive covenants be okay? And why would they decide that that's legal, but that cities couldn't do that? Why do you think that might be? And it's okay if you don't know. I'm just checking to kind of see what yeah, exactly. Professor Schuster's got it right. It's a private agreement versus what the state, right, the quote unquote state is doing, or the local is doing. So the private agreement is fine, at least certainly. Yeah, good job, Amber. During this time. So these private agreements, that's going to be an important point, and I think that's something maybe that might be relevant to consider for your class too. What is this? What does this relationship mean when land use planning is being decided? So we'll move on, but we'll come back to it. So by 1934, we're full into the Great Depression, right? There's a lot of New Deal types of programs happening, and the Federal Housing Administration gets created to address some of this, right? It's meant to stimulate the housing industry, and what it basically does is it provides loan opportunities for long-term low interest rate loans for people to be able to buy a house, right? Which hadn't really been possible in the same way before that. It really ends up being the foundation for a growing middle class. And it also is one of the primary ways that folks begin to have this opportunity to develop wealth. And we'll come back to this idea of wealth too. But this is a foundational moment in which this administration is created to provide those opportunities. The problem is, though, that the Federal Housing Administration mandated racial restrictions and required them as conditions for home loans, right? So basically, this beginning to link this race with value and property value, and then that gets used to justify. And I'm using Dr. Hernandez's quotes because you'll get to hear from him in a couple of weeks. The formal use of racially restrictive covenants to maintain these racial boundaries. So this becomes a way to maintain those relationships, a formal way to be able to do that. And the assumption, though, here is that the presence of Black families was inherently detrimental to land value. Realize, though, that of course this is a social construction. This isn't a real relationship. This is something that's been created by other humans to connect these two things together to justify essentially segregation and maintaining segregation. And it does, right? It keeps maintaining that hierarchy and preserves that status quo, right? In the same way that Jim Crow is used in the South to preserve that status quo, that's what's also happening in other parts of the country through this formalization. Now, of course, we know that segregation existed before this and racially restrictive covenants existed before this, but this is one of the main ways that it gets institutionalized and embedded right into our system, into our institutions, right? That's what that means, right? That institutionalization. And there are going to be huge consequences up to this very day, which you'll also be hearing about from some of the other speakers that come along. So what it technically happens is that prior to the FHA coming into existence, there was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, people just call them HOLC, who had created these maps, right? And I'll show you some examples of them in just a minute, where the maps, you'll see that there'll be designations that are shown here, like you have green, which is first grade. Sometimes this one's a little bit older map. They'll have different kinds of of wording how they describe it, but for the most part, they're describing the same kinds of things. So areas that were green or first grade or best, although this still looks kind of anyway, were basically where mortgage lenders were going to make the loans, right? They felt like those areas were the best areas and the least risk, right, in terms of loaning. Areas that are the second grade or the blue areas still desirable. They might not make as many loans or as extensive of a loan, but they're still good areas for lending. The declining area is yellow, and then the hazardous area, right? So this is where redlining comes from, because these areas get marked in red, and they're not going to give loans in those particular areas. So the FHA basically takes this and uses this as its way to decide what are going to be areas that should get loans and should get support and have economic investment. And please understand that these categories are actually almost entirely based on who lives there. It's not actually necessarily based on whether it's actually best, right, or actually declining or actually anything except that who is living there. And those are going to be based, of course, on racial and economic, the racial demographics of that time, right? So that's what we're really talking about. And this is why this is a huge, huge issue. And the consequences are really important to understand. So this is a map. This is Detroit. And I'll show you a couple of these just so you can see. But I picked Detroit for a reason, because one is I can always tell where 8 Mile Road is. It's right here. And I'll show you why later that becomes even easier to understand where that is. But I also want to draw your attention to this spot right here. So you see this redlined area, right? So meaning that this is going to be African American families. But this section right here that doesn't have any marking, we're going to come back to this in just a few minutes. So I don't know, you can screenshot it, keep it in your mind. Maybe I'll pop back to it. But this is what this looks like, right? So redlining, again, these are areas are not going to get any kind of economic support, but green areas and blue areas are the ones that are going to get that kind of investment. And so this is New York City. I like to show New York City because people, there's certainly lots and lots of different people that have come from all over that live there. And then when we look later, sort of if you're looking at where you can notice where this is Manhattan, right? You can see where areas are redlined. You can see here's Central Park right here. So, just kind of keep some of this in mind as we look later. We'll look at some more current maps as well. Here is San Francisco, also an area with lots and lots of people, but really distinctive areas where investment, right, is going to be our home loans are going to be given. So this is Golden Gate Park right here. And then here's Sacramento. So here's downtown Sacramento. I'll talk in just a minute about some of the specifics of this West End area in Sacramento. That's where a lot of the work that Dr. Hernandez has done to look at this. But some things that might be familiar. This is Sac City College is right over here. Here's the train track. This is like Curtis Park is right here. This is Oak Park over here. There's East Sac. And so, you can see this must be Stockton Boulevard right here. So just to have some sense of where things are. And sort of what this is before I-5, right before 99 comes in there. So we'll be coming back to this map as well. So with some examples of when we're talking about specific areas, how a rating might come about. This is a description of that one of the West End areas in Sacramento that I pointed to, and so you can. It's great. I have a link to this stuff. I'll either put in the chat or somehow share with you, so you can go explore cities all over the United States. And many of them have clickable. Where you click on the different categorizations, you can actually find documents, right, that look like this to show what were examples of how the ratings were used and what the kind of the language. So on this particular one, if you look, so here's favorable influences. Well, it's convenient transportation, like trains, right there, schools, churches, trading, amusement areas near the city center, proximity to centers of commercial and industrial employment, detrimental influences. This is going to be the thing that is often what is going to be decided, of course, what kind of rating it gets. So highly congested population whose density greatly exceeds cities' average, right? So you have concentrated populations, presence in large numbers of subversive racial elements, right? That's going to be a big factor. What subversive means, I don't actually know here, but it's super interesting, and I definitely want to ask Dr. Hernandez about that. But you look down here. This is also embedded, right? This is into the actual designation itself. So it's looking at foreign-born families, 75%, and this is not seen as a positive, right? For the most part, that's part of the designation. Probably the lower the number, the better is in terms of getting a better designation. And then there's this is also Negro becomes its own category, and this you see on everyone. And so, in what percent relief, I believe, has to do with sort of what we might talk about as TANF or other kinds of aspects to welfare these days. And so, this is talking about income, right? Lower income families. Then on the bottom of this one is also interesting to see historically. So already you can see right here, security grade D, right? So this is a redlined area, but this old area is the melting pot of Sacramento, right? So this is, this idea of melting pot is being used in a negative sense for sure. It contains the principal Japanese colony and the greatest concentration of Negroes in the city. There are no deed restrictions, so meaning there are not racially restrictive covenants here. And zoning is for general commercial use. Dwellings are cheap, medium construction, quality of maintenance, all this kind of stuff is talking about. Oh, and here it also mentions the predominance of subversive racial elements are the area's chief hazard. So again, right, this relationship between race and value, rather than thinking of it as a place for investment, right? It's going to be not have any connection or access to that or opportunity for that. As we go along, I was trying to find one on the positive end. Most of the ones in Sacramento I was clicking on, there wasn't a document connected to them, or it was missing or something. So I just went to Oakland and picked in the Oakland Hills to see how it might be described. And here's some of the Professor Schuster. Sorry, should I go back? What was the Oriental? I think. What was the the subversive elements? Is that what you're talking about? Oh, okay. Interesting. So that would be, I'm super curious about that history. So this one, you can see favorable influence, beautiful sylvan setting among pine and eucalyptus trees, fine view. So in single family residential, highly restricted, right? What does that mean? That means that there are racially restrictive covenants there, right? They're seeing that as a positive here. And so, so again, right, these are all, and it's interesting, if you have bought a house or ever imagine buying a house, check out your appraisal, because even though the language has changed, sometimes it doesn't feel like the descriptions are necessarily all that different, even though the racial language isn't permissible anymore. So it's something to check out. Okay, and so another example of, here's another example of what a racially restrictive covenant. I haven't been able to find the date for that one, so I don't actually know. So I just mostly threw it in here. But, again, it's just another way that it could be explained. No, you can't lease it, convey, rent, sell, or any, in whole or part, to any person who's not white, right? That's pretty clear. No person other than someone who's white, right? And we're not even going to bother listing out all of the people. If you're not white, you can't occupy, rent, buy anything, this particular, whatever that property is. And I mentioned when we were looking at the Detroit map, that little section. Actually, maybe I should just go back to it. So notice this. You know what? I'm not, because I can't zoom into it, or I don't know how to do that. But there's a little section. So in the 40s, there's a developer who wants to come in that little white section that we saw that was undeveloped, who wants to build a community. But the lenders say, no, you can't do that because of this African-American community that's right there, right in that redlined area that we saw. And the developer says, okay, what if I build a wall? And then the lender says, okay, build a wall, and then you can develop your community. And so we'll come back to that, right? But all right, I'm seeing a question. Could subversion mean that there are racial undertones, since a lot of people at the time would believe that people of color were trying to subvert? It could very well be. And thank you. I just want to say thank you, Christopher, for coming. He's a student from my class. Could be. This is the details of some of this history. I don't know, but I find it fascinating. And I think it would be really interesting to explore that much more. And I'll definitely ask Dr. Hernandez about that too, because I know that he's an expert in that aspect of Sacramento history. So we'll try to find the answer to that question and pass that on. So in Detroit here, so they built this wall. The wall, at least in part, still exists to this day. And I'll show you that in a minute. But, again, there's this connection, this continuing connection between the idea of race, which we could go on about race as a social construction itself, but this social construction of race connected to value and property value that has long-lasting impacts, right? Privileges for some and economic abandonment for others. So the consequences then really, and this is also from Dr. Hernandez, is that while the FHA actively protected the property rights of the new homogenous white suburban communities, that means that certainly there had been a lot of immigrants coming from Europe, but they end up assimilating more or less into what becomes, how we think of what white means. And so there's not those same kinds of distinctions, right? By the time we're at this point in history, but it prohibited non-white access to wealth accumulation opportunities that were gained only through housing credit and home ownership. And again, that's going to be something we're coming back to over and over and over again. Basically, that neighborhoods of color, that were already forced into segregation, were deemed unworthy of investment. All right, now as we move ahead a little bit, also we're going to look at Sacramento a little bit more specifically. So during World War II, we have a similar kind of migration pattern, but this is also out to the west. So we see a lot of African American families moving out west to Sacramento. We have military bases here. We have an example. So the question is example of systemic racism. Are you saying this is an example of systemic racism? Or are you asking me for an example?
Yeah, that was an example of systematic racism, right?
Yeah, you're right on. Yeah, because systemic means you have things built into multiple institutions, and one of the things that we'll see is how, especially as we look at the consequences in terms of wealth inequality, right, how that impacts multiple institutions. So absolutely, right, when it's built into the processes and policies of your society, absolutely excellent. Thank you. Yes, that is an example of systematic racism. Okay, so in Sacramento, we have some demographic shifts. We have African American families moving also, again, because there's work, right? With the military buildup, there's a work that's happening out west here. And so we also actually in the 1950s as well, there is part of the Bracero program for Latinx workers for bringing Mexican folks up. And so, there's a lot of issues about that in general because part of the Bracero program is actually used to break strikes and things like that for Latinx folks who are Latin Americans who are already here and have been here sometimes for centuries. Whole other discussion, but so there's a lot of shift actually in terms of labor and in terms of the many different groups that are coming to the region. One of the things that also happens is there's urban renewal is one of the things that's part of investing in communities. But for many especially in the West End, that really doesn't happen. What it really means is that we're going to shift to commercial development there. We're going to push out all of the folks who were living in these redlined areas, and they're going to be displaced, right? And so they're looking for somewhere else to live, and that means that where there aren't racially restrictive covenants, we're going to see that the spillover into those communities that had been all white at some point because of that. And they might still be redlined, right? But or one of the other categories, but they're looking for someplace to live, and so suburban demand is increasing, but of course the suburbs at that time aren't so far out maybe as we think of them now. I will just say as an aside, there is a case in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer. I didn't include on here It does say that actually racially restrictive covenants are not enforceable. It doesn't say that they're illegal, because they're still, as Professor Schuster said before, private agreements, but that state courts can't enforce them. Now we'll come back to what does that mean, right? Case law. I immediately, my first thought is almost always going to Brown versus Board of Education, which says, I mean, I don't know if anybody, maybe I'll ask that. Hey, does anybody know what Brown versus Board of Education, what the, if the one thing you're on Final Jeopardy and you need to know the one thing that it held. Does anybody know that? Anybody pop that in the chat? I'm just curious. I hadn't planned on this question, but I think it's a really interesting example. Anybody? Dun, dun, dun. Well, that's the idea, right, behind it, is that it desegregated schools. But basically, it said separate is inherently unequal, right? Yeah, I mean, it was about educational segregation, and it said separate is inherently unequal. It was responding to Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal, right? So, but in that case, separate is inherently unequal, and that's 1954, right? So that's all during this time period too. But what do you think that means? Do you think that schools just in 1955 then all desegregated? Do you think that happened? Yeah, we just put Y or N. Yeah, right. Nope. Good. Lots of nopes. Right. So when did they desegregate? 56, 57, 58. It took time. How much time? How much time did it take? Yeah. We never we definitely got up there. I mean, there was effort, and it really took into the 60s and the Civil Rights Act to have some teeth, actually, because most school districts just said, yeah, make us. Right. Well, Little Rock Nine is part of it, but there's lots and lots of areas that are saying, yeah, make us. And so Civil Rights Act does help some of that, but even then, right? Not 1965, 66, 67. Yeah, 90s. And the 90s, that was still segregated. Yeah, I went to school at LSU in Louisiana, and they just even begun, and this was in the 80s, right, to begun to even think about it. So we definitely desegregated to some extent, and this is not a talk about educational segregation, so I won't go on about it, but we reached the height of desegregation in the 80s, and actually we've been resegregating since, but that's another day. Private but equal, and not even then, right? So anyway, so back to Sacramento. And so you have folks that are, and the other thing actually that's happening, right, are freeways are being built. So if we look at this map, right, as I mentioned before, this is where I-5 is going to go, 99 is going to come over here somewhere. Let me think of where we are on this map. Yeah, because this is Sac City, right? So 99 is actually going to be right here. So a lot of displacement of folks during this time, and this is back to that West End area that ends up being more of commercial development and than actually investing in it as a place for living, right? So certainly not for Black and Brown folks for the most part. Make sure I'm not. And this map is 1950. I couldn't read the little tiny thing. I had to go find the article itself. So 1950 is what we're talking about, this displacement. And so into the 50s and 60s in Sacramento, we, as I said, have this demand for suburban housing, which isn't, again, the suburbs aren't so far away during this time. And in fact, Oak Park is I think maybe technically the first suburb, perhaps. And well, I mean, it had existed before this, but there weren't restrictive covenants. It was certainly redlining, either the red or the yellow, where there weren't going to be any kind of mortgages. And so what ends up happening, though, is because, again, technically racially restrictive covenants aren't enforceable. But basically my point with Brown was that, yeah, it just because you have a case law doesn't necessarily mean that behavior and patterns are going to change. And that's going back to Amber's point about it being systemic, right? That's what happens in systems and institutions, is that the patterns, even when laws change, the patterns of behavior and interactions don't change quickly at all without some pretty dramatic shifts in the institution itself. So you have folks that are moving into integrating communities. You have, but I have to go back to work. Oh, okay, cool, great. Thanks for your participation, Amber. And so you have families that are integrating neighborhoods or wanting to integrate neighborhoods, just fine with that. Local developers, though, real estate folks, property owners are working really hard to prevent that from happening. So they, racial steering means they basically say, oh, well, I don't think you want to be in that neighborhood. Let me show you over here, right? And then you also have people themselves who are refusing to sell or rent, which is perfectly legal. And also then overtly organizing to overturn what fair housing laws exist out there. So in Oak Park, for example, there weren't restrictive covenants, and we're trying to get around some of the redlining, or the lack of available financing. People would have these contracts where the title would stay in the seller's name, but they would pay them off slowly over time. And so that was one of the ways that folks were trying to get around that. But we'll see some other consequences as these neighborhoods, where that's working, where neighborhoods are integrating as well. So we'll see that in just a moment here. And just making sure I'm not okay. And this this also comes from Dr. Hernandez's, one of his articles that I've been looking at. And one of the things he said, and I just was hoping I could kind of show it on this map. I don't know if he'll talk about it or not, but he talked about this X in Sacramento. I don't know if you can see it here, where sort of this east part of the X and more or less this west part of the X are the ones that have access to, well, first of all, they make use of racially restricted covenants, but they're also able to get loans and have investments in them. But then the south and north are parts of this X here, which include much of South Sacramento, North Highlands, Strawberry Heights, and so on, who again are not receiving that economic support and investment. And so those are things that are going to be some of the foundation of some of the things that Dr. Hernandez will talk about. So Fair Housing Act comes along in 1968. And so ideally, it's meant to protect people from discrimination when they rent or buy, get a mortgage, all of these things we've been talking about being excluded from, basically to support folks to be able to do that. But let me just ask you, what do laws need in order to do what they're supposed to do? So tell me in the chat, what do they need? This is another aspect of institutional change, right? So we already know that just because something changes doesn't mean behavior changes. What else do they need? Laws themselves. There's case law and then there's legislation in terms of laws require enforcement. Yes, A+, good job, right. They require enforcement. And so one of the ways that actually the Fair Housing Act gets passed is essentially through the removal of its enforcement mechanisms, and funding, of course, will go along with that. And that's going to be a really important factor, of course, right? And if we're trying to make institutional change sincerely, then it's going to actually require quite a bit more from us to be able to make sure that that happens. So even though there's definitely not enforcement mechanisms built in, so many areas are not going to, many folks of color are not going to see really the benefits of fair housing enacted. But the other thing that's going to happen is even when there are areas where folks are integrating, one of the things that we see then is white flight. Now, white flight existed before. This is what, as I mentioned, at times where at different pushes when folks of color are being pushed out of communities and into other ones that don't have racially restrictive covenants, white flight occurs, right? Because either people, the folks there, as I said, organize to try to keep folks of color out, and if they can't, then they're often leaving. But we see this process happen particularly after the Fair Housing Act. And it really is exacerbated during this time period. And so there's the same kinds of things of trying to scare folks of color into not living in a particular neighborhood, or if they do move in, trying to get them to leave. And when those things don't work, then we also see that white families are leaving. And so there's a tremendous consequence for this economic abandonment. And so, there's certainly loss of the fear, right? The reason people are leaving is they have some fear about decline in their neighborhood and fear of loss of value, which of course has already been established a long time ago by this fictitious relationship between race and value, right, and property value. So they have those fears already, and in fact there was a loss of value, but what we understand is that that's not because families of color move in, right? That's not about that. It's actually because of the white flight itself, right? When white families are leaving, they're taking the resources with them, right? They're taking, well, there's going to be consequences of loss of social services, decline in schools. This is divestment, right, from these communities. So value is declining, but again, it's not because families of color move in, it's because white families move out. And so when they're leaving, they're taking with them some important things. They're taking businesses with them, right? Which means they're taking jobs, they're taking taxes, demand, they're taking demand with them, right? So in terms of housing, and if most demand is going to the suburbs, anybody had Econ 101, what does that mean? What if demand is going somewhere else? What is that going to mean for the community that's left and for the community where the demand is? What's the bottom line? Actually, I don't know if it's a bottom line. No supply, right? Yeah. And so what does that mean? If supply and demand, exactly, right? Supply or demand anyway is going to be where the value is, right? Because supply and demand, if you have a high demand, then you have higher value. Thank you, Benjamin. Yeah. So that's what ends up, of course, connecting to decreasing property values is you're taking all of the benefits, all of the resources, all of the value with you in those circumstances. And it may be very difficult, again, right, depending on the community, especially red line communities, to get loans to start new businesses and to have value in the homes and to get a loan for homes anyway. So and all of those things. So property value. Tell me now what you know about property. What is property value connected to in communities? What kinds of things benefit or don't, right, depending on the property value? What's connected to that? Anybody? Or what do you think is? It's okay to be wrong, by the way. Yeah, so taxes. Yeah, who or what benefits from property taxes? Yeah, land, area, resources. Yeah. What else? Public service. And when you say public service, what do you mean? How are schools? Yeah, schools, roads, parks, library, recreation areas. Right. Yeah. So property value declines, then you have a loss of your tax base, right? All of these things y'all are talking about. And that could be your local services, could be police, right? Could be firefighters, could be any of those kinds of things. Schools are not entirely funded by local property taxes, but certainly a good chunk of them are. And so loss of property value or low property value is certainly going to impact schools for sure. Everything y'all are saying in the chat definitely are going to be impacted by that, right? So realize that families of color did not bring instability with them, right? They brought themselves to live in a community. And so it's really, again, white flight, white people leaving that created these circumstances, economic abandonment. And so hopefully, I don't know hopefully you have a big enough screen, parcel tax support schools. Right. So, and I just want to show you, these are now 10-year-old census maps. And I suspect all these folks will, with the next census, hopefully if we have a reliable one, will create these maps. But I've used these maps for years, and I used the ones, before with the 2000 census too. And I'll I'll make sure that there's a link so you can go find these, because you can zoom in so you can see the individual dots, which is pretty amazing to me. And I really enjoy being able to look at these and see. So this is more or less where we live now. So we're going to look at some of the maps that that we looked at the redlining maps before and see where people live. So in these particular maps, the white dots, and this probably just looks like a blur, but these are all dots, again, based on census tracts, are individual one person, one dot. And this is Detroit. And I can tell this is 8 Mile Road, probably for the same reason you can, right? You can see that there's actually a really distinctive line between where Black folks are living and where white folks are living. And then where we looked at before was over here somewhere, which you can imagine very possibly white flight happened, right? From at some point anyway, because the neighborhood that the contractor wanted to build was right next to one of these African-American neighborhoods. And but many maps in the city, in cities in the north in particular, and the west, and even in California, you can see really distinctly. If you can see distinct colors, then you know that's the vast majority of people that are living there. Like we're really living quite separately for the most part. Where you can't tell, once you get to look at the maps themselves. This is actually the wall. So I went on Google Maps and I just walked down the street, which is one of my favorite things to do in cities anywhere in the world, is to go walk down the street. So this is actually, I probably should have put a link and then we could look at it ourselves and kind of scan the wall. But you can see that, and this is the neighborhood that on this side of the wall that was the built for the white folks, white families. And this on this side would have been the neighborhood that existed with Black families. And so, you can go yourself and look for it. But yeah, super interesting to see that it's mostly still there. But there's a lot of civil rights artwork on here, and a lot, that's really looking at the history of this, that when folks are painting on the wall here too. Oh, yay, good. I have another picture. I forgot I put that in there. A lot of interesting stuff there. So this is New York City again, and where there certainly are like neighborhoods like here. You can see it's hard to tell. It looks kind of brownish. There's a bunch of different colors that are in here. You can see that there certainly are neighborhoods where there's a lot more overlap, and yet at the same time there's some pretty distinctive areas in which one group or another lived. And if you go back and look at sort of some of the histories of those areas, may have been redlined, racial restricted, may have been a part of white flight, where again the neighborhood shifted in demographics. But even in New York City, even though there are definitely places of overlap, this is actually, I think over here is must be New Jersey, right? And that you can see that for the most part, even in places we think of as being really incredibly diverse, people mostly are not living with each other. And this is Bay Area. Again, this one is so hard to capture when it's so far away, but going in, you can zoom into particular areas we were looking at. So this is Alameda. So, right, this would have been that Montclair area, I think, up here. I think it's kind of near Berkeley. Yes, there are places of overlap. And California does have some cities that, Del Paso Heights, and that's what I meant to say when I said Strawberry Heights, but yeah, Del Paso Heights would be an example of white flight, like that white folks live there. And then could be, I think it's in that V that Dr. Hernandez talked about, where it might have been, I'm not sure if you know that history of that particular neighborhood more, it could very well be an example of that, actually. I just don't know the specific history with if white folks had lived there and then left. It could be, if that's the case, then it was predominantly white, then you're probably right. Yeah, then very, very well could be what we're talking about, because it is some of those areas that, and similar to Oak Park then, yeah, very, very possibly. I can't say 100%, but it sounds like it could very well fit that pattern for sure. And then Sacramento, and I'll zoom in a little bit more, but I wanted to include Woodland and Davis as well. So again, where you can look at sort of what becomes the X here, right? Still, there are definitely more, actually, maybe where ARC is, somewhere over here, right? Much more integrated communities, but for the most part, in the suburbs of Sacramento and East Sacramento, still predominantly white. The pocket actually has become much more integrated too, but there's certainly still these areas, Lamb Park and Curtis Park, that are predominantly white as well. And racial makeups of Davis and Woodland being somewhat different. And then, and actually this is like Rancho Cordova, a bit more. And then this is looking east, and I think ARC must be over here somewhere. Still, you can see predominantly white dots, right? And then moving out again, Rancho Cordova. This is Folsom, El Dorado Hills, Roseville up here. Yeah, so you can look at sort of where we are today, and see. And I'm not gonna. I want you to think about what this is right here, which also tells us things about other institutions and aspects of our systems. Anybody know what this is? Any idea? This is Folsom, just for the, what is this? This is Folsom Lake up here. Yeah, that's Folsom Prison. Yeah. And so, yeah, again, another discussion, another institutional discussion about concentrating folks of color and targeting folks of color. But I looked at sort of just where we are more or less. Data is not always, this kind of stuff is not always as easy to come by as I think it ought to be. And this is really just from Zillow. So I don't even know that how accurate that is, honestly. But it does it's not so much the number, but the relationship between numbers. And that's been consistently the same. So if we look at property value in Sacramento proper, it's significantly different than property values in El Dorado Hills, right? And as our suburbs, even though El Dorado Hills is its own town, certainly our suburbs have gotten further and further out where people go. And then looking at that, this is from a city data site, but home ownership rates, and all of a sudden I can't see it because get off of there. Okay, okay. Home ownership rates also significantly different, right, from Sacramento to El Dorado Hills. And you can look at racial distribution in those. You can go look at those maps and you can see for yourself some of the potential issues, right, at least historically, that would be connected to that. And so, as I've been saying, institutional stuff, institutions are connected to each other. Access to wealth, how about, that's a really good question. Apartment versus single family. Yeah, percent. Yeah. I think that's a really important, because yes, concentrating people in a smaller space is also telling us something too. I don't know that data, but that would be an important one to find out. But these institutions, how they're connected to each other, right? Think about the relationship between, and for me, most of the work that I've done is in relation to seeing the impact of wealth on, there's actually really excellent data now about the relationship between wealth and health, that literally the more wealth, even incrementally, that you have, the better health, right? And that's been one of the newer areas of looking at issues in relation to racism. And we think about policing, the more oversight of communities that have been economically abandoned, and in some ways, what you're talking about, the percent of apartments versus single family, might relate to that kind of oversight, and over oversight. And y'all already talked about education funding being bound up with local property taxes. So again, even though it's not the full funding doesn't come from local property, it's certainly a significant amount of it does. That it makes a huge different. So these institutions are interlocking, right? They support each other. And when we see that inequities and injustices that are built into them, those things get pronounced, right, across institutions. So I think about them just, as another little aside about how we talk about equity and the equity gap now, but it could be the opportunity gap, it could be the education gap, it could be health gaps, right? That how connected wealth is to it. And so who has had access to it, and hasn't, right? These things are really important to understand in terms of what's happening institutionally. And just a little aside about a little bit more looking at the relationship between wealth and academics, right? And in terms of segregation, these are, these are continuingly important to understand. And again, education is just one area, but many, many areas are impacted. Institutional areas are impacted by this. Okay, so back to this question I asked you all at the beginning. What does this have to do with your class? What does it have to do with land use planning? What does it have to do with land use? What does it have to do with planning? What are some of your thoughts about that? And you can, if it's okay, you're welcome to speak, but if you want to type it into the chat, that's fine too. What have y'all learned from what's being built in the areas? Okay. And what does that mean? Do you mean in terms of housing? Do you mean in terms of commercial development? What do you mean? What's being built? What does that mean? Okay. All right. All right. And so, one other thing I didn't talk about this, but I suspect you'll talk about, you're talking about this in like who's impacted by commercial development too, right? Because there certainly are environmental emissions and all those kinds of things, where things get built, who gets impacted by environmental impact stuff, right? And who's more likely to, types of houses. Okay. So maybe that relates also back to whether it's apartments or houses and things like that. Zoning is a big deal. Zoning limits are important pieces. Right. Right. And what something gets zoned for, what's allowable, planner's impact, what can and how many lots on a parcel. Okay, certainly. Yeah, variances are important. So will you explain that, since that's not something I mean, I've heard of variances, but will you tell me more about how does that relate? What specifically does that mean? Oh, okay. To do something. So a variance is like if you want to do something different with your property and you get a variance, and people who have money are more likely to get that variance. Is that what I'm hearing you say? I see. Right. Wow. Interesting. That is a really interesting point. That's a one of those very much local details that right. Good. Wow. Ah, interesting. Yeah. Wow. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I see. And Natalia has a good point here too. Like even residential, not everywhere. Chickens and garden, right? And I think actually urban gardening issues are super interesting, and actually how supportive they can be for families or folks who are unhoused. I know there's a group of, well, actually all over or guerrilla gardeners who will go and graft even edible fruit and other kinds of things onto trees in cities that just have decorative trees, so that you can actually have something that's productive, right, and useful to communities. So I know that's not necessarily what you're saying, but it did remind me of that. I think that there's a public discussion, but also private. Oh, okay, that's a very good point too. I know that I don't know a lot about those processes, but I can imagine that that's true too. So, do you all? How about things like racially restrictive covenants or consequences of redlining? Do you see work in this class that, even if it's, I mean, there's a lot of technical stuff in your class, but do you see ways that it might connect with sort of historical issues or things that might be need to be considered. Fruits attract rodents, right? That's a good point too. Yeah, yeah. My chickens attract rodents for sure. But do you see, are there any connections that y'all are thinking about that might relate to specific, or at least history that might need to be considered as part of land use decisions that get made now? Are there any things you can think of in relation to that? Maybe that's a future discussion too, as you go, and maybe you'll think of things as well. How about restrictive use for seniors? Okay, sure. What does that mean? Tell me what that means. Um, Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, especially, I mean, there are particular issues when communities aren't as diverse already. Like, are you replicating that then, right? Are you, if you're already just using people that already live there? Um, if it's a residential area with a lot of concrete or black type equals redlining areas. So are you suggesting that if that's something that we see now, that that might have been a redlined area? Is that part of your question? If it's a residential area, yeah, okay, possibly. You know what I would do, and this is why I love maps. Maps are, you know, I think I'd be a geographer if I got to do it again. But I would love to, I like to overlay things. Like I had students when I asked you about the, you know, what that particular section was, and it was Folsom Prism. I had students when I do this activity in my class who will go and see if, you know, concentrations of people actually turn out to be a prison, and they found many, and they actually found what they thought were immigration prisons too. And you know, looking at it with the distribution map, and then looking at it on Google Maps and seeing what's there, if it's labeled. Sometimes they're not labeled, by the way. And so I think you could probably do the same kinds of things, right? You could overlay, well, where were these redlined areas? Where were these, you know, or where were these urban renewal areas where folks got pushed out, and see what's there, right? And see how things have changed. So, so it could be. I mean, mostly redlined areas. Yeah, I mean, it could be that they're, because of the lack of investment, right, and economic investment, may very well have declined, right, and not had any of the kinds of investment that other communities had. So it could very well be. Yeah. No, I missed that. Oh, wow. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, I don't know, but I can imagine because, all of this. But let me just, the last thing I just want to say, and this is works on a small scale too, is that, and that actually I'm kind of transforming another quote that has to do with design, that I, in another class that I teach, that if you're not trying to design bias out, then you're succeeding in designing it in. And so I just sort of flipped that, right? It's the same idea, is that if you're not overtly building equity and justice into the system or whatever it is that you're creating, then you are keeping it out, right? It's not, these things don't just happen. We have such a foundation of institutional and systemic racism that we have to not only have overt intentions, but it has to be built into it. We have to embed it in what we're doing because it's not going to just manage to seep itself in there. So hopefully whatever projects that you work on, you can be thinking about what are the, short-term, long-term justice related consequences, right? How do we, and it's not just how do we not do something that's racist, it's how do we actually um, embed something that's going to build more fairness and justice into our system, so in the sense that so many people have been excluded from it. How do we address that? And I do hope that you'll get some good discussions with the next sets of folks that are going to be talking to you, because and it doesn't mean that there's easy answers to that, as you may find out, but hopefully they'll also give you some good practical things to be thinking about right now. So that's basically it. I will include these I will include the dot map too. I'll put that on here, and then Professor Schuster can share anything. But you can go look at the redlining maps and then look at the descriptions, and then I'll put the one person, one dot. It's not hard to find online, but I'll include it on here too. So thank you all for being patient and hanging out and asking good questions and participating. I really appreciate that. So I'm excited for your class, the rest of the stuff you're going to learn. So thank you. That's it from me.
All right. Well, thank you, Diane. Yeah, and so there's a couple. Let me go back, and I'm going to put, if you're in my class, you're going to get a copy of the recording anyway, because it'll be on and I hope I got all of it. I have 3 mics that I have to run. And so if I forgot,
Professor Schuster, do you have more of your class? What is?
Yeah, we actually have our lab right now. So if anybody, are you still available to ask questions or anything like that? Or so we've got. Let's see, did I put that on there? Yeah. So I've got that on there. So so here's what's up now. We have lab, and there's really nothing to do in lab because we're starting a new. Whoops, sorry about that. I had one mic on and one mic off. Like I said, I got too many mics going on here.
That's okay. I just thought I'd hang out.
Yeah. So we have lab now.
Okay.
And hopefully I caught most of this. I got all of Diane on there. There were times when other people were talking and I was talking that I had one mic off or one mic on, and maybe on the recording. But so anyway, we're in lab now, and so we don't really have a class because this was the class. And we're going to start talking about our land planning documents actually on Thursday. Which so the timing is right in there. So if you're available, if anybody still has any questions, you can go ahead and ask them, or comments, or want to bring up some of the side tangents. Here's the hard part. Yes. So Shivani asked, will we still have the Design 300 class? Yes, we will. And that one is going to be focusing on modularization estimates. So yeah, we'll still have that. However, since Thursday is the review day, if you have to go do something because you took this time, we'll be able to still handle the 11 o'clock class on Thursday too. And Shivani, I think I looked at your submittal so far and it's looking fine. But I'll tell you, this is such a hard thing to talk about on planning because everything seems so reasonable, and it's that private versus government. It's passive versus active. It's really trying to get yourself into a position where you can do something. And when you're just doing drawings, sometimes that's hard, but you want to be thinking about those things. So does anybody have any questions or comments for Diane now that I've blathered on for a bit?
All right. I will. Yeah, I'll be present. Yeah.
See, I got one thing on and one thing. So this balance between the private interest and the interest of the government and the society is a constant battle. And that's because there isn't a right and a wrong. There's just good process. And so what we're talking about here is how do you institutionalize good process versus institutionalizing bad process. So there we go. That's what will be going on when we talk about our land planning documents. So cool. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.